When I was a kid, I remember playing the Nintendo 64 for the very first time and being a little thrown off by the configuration of the D-pad and then the analog stick in the center and the buttons on the right. And I remember it took me a bit of getting used to understand how to properly hold and use this controller. But the big appeal and the big revolutionary feature of that controller was its analog joystick. However, as time's passed and consoles have progressed and we've seen new hardware with new controllers and new styles of controllers, it seems like that Nintendo 64 controller is kind of like a quirky controller of that era. It's something that worked really well at the time, but as it's aged, it hasn't really aged so well. And in getting back into my Nintendo 64 collection and really playing the Nintendo 64 more deeply in recent times, I decided to upgrade from my old beat up Nintendo 64 controller, but instead of just getting another standard N64 controller, I looked at a brand called, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, called Kiwitata, who makes this controller here. And this controller changes a lot of the, what I would consider flaws of the original N64 controller, but also improves upon it in a lot of ways. So in this video, I'm gonna go over some of the things that I really like about this controller and why you should consider getting this for your Nintendo 64 setup. So let's take a look. So to start, the packaging for this was pretty standard, I guess, for a brand that I'd never heard of. I bought a couple of these random Amazon purchases from what I believe to be relatively smaller or almost unknown brands, and the packaging isn't, how do I say it, something to write home about. However, one thing I want to highlight, the way this was packaged internally seemed a little risky. Now, I'm happy in the fact that my controller from Kiwitata did not come with any scuffs, breaks, or marks or anything on it, but the way it was packaged, this was just basically thrown into a bag and put into a loose box, and there's no bumpers or anything to stop this controller from rattling around, which is something that for some people, especially myself included, is something to be concerned about, because even some of the cheaper controllers that I've purchased off of Amazon usually have pretty solid packaging. And in this case, I would say this was probably out of the gate the biggest fault of getting this controller. Now, getting into the actual controller itself, one thing I did realize was plugging in the controller, this was the connectors the 3-prong connectors that you have for N64 controllers. This one was just slightly crooked by, let's say, like 1/8 of an inch. And when I was pushing it into the controller socket at first, I actually thought I was gonna break it because I felt a lot of resistance. Now, beyond these two deficits, I will report that this controller came fine. There was no deficits from its shipping, and it did work once I plugged it in that first time, but it was definitely something worth noting when it came to this controller. Now, the biggest thing that I've had an issue with any N64 controller, even when I was a kid, even the ones I've had in recent times, tends to be the joystick. The joysticks, oftentimes, I'm not gonna say I understand the fundamentals of it, but they're very mechanically built, even the official Nintendo ones. And that mechanism, or however those are put together, seems to loosen up over time and seems to also, I assume due to friction, start to basically not respond as well. And my current N64 controller, my blue one here, the problem that I've had over the recent times of using it is it seems like the responsiveness is almost disappearing entirely in some cases. Playing Zelda, Link will be running and then all of a sudden just start going to a slow crawl essentially because the joystick isn't responding anymore unless I'm pushing in ultra tight into the controller, which I'm going to wager is just going to damage that joystick more. So this controller here from Kiwitata, however, one of the biggest things it takes is not trying to mimic the original N64 controller's joystick, but instead It's almost as if they just stole the mechanism or the type of analog stick that you use in a GameCube controller and integrated it into this. And I'm gonna argue that this is beautiful. It works incredibly well. It feels very tight, feels very responsive. I also tried some old shooters like GoldenEye, and it feels like this is a huge step up even from a standard N64 controller. It seems like the dead zones are nice, they're tight, and they're working exactly how they're supposed to. And it just generally feels smooth, which is everything I'm looking for in a standard controller. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is if you look at this design, it almost looks like the N64's version of a Dreamcast controller, but there's no center Z button or Z trigger on this controller. Instead, those have been moved to the shoulder, and they basically just mimic one another. So if you use the left-facing one, it does the exact same thing as the right-facing one, but that did take a little bit of getting used to, but after playing long enough, it worked and it made complete sense, and this feels like a modern version of an N64 controller in a good way. And one of the things that I have observed in the past with some of these cheaper, or I don't want to say cheaper, third-party style controllers is that the buttons themselves don't always feel great. My opinion is the A, B, and the C buttons, and the start button, as far as I'm concerned, feel very close to the original N64s. They are a little tighter, but they're not tight enough that they feel cheap. They feel very similar to the N64's original buttons, which is a very good thing. The only thing that I would say feels quite different and doesn't feel good at all in comparison would be the D-pad. However, we always have to look at the fact that most N64 games use the D-pad almost as, you know, some games it was like a selection tool. It wasn't really a core focus, and very few games actually use the D-pad as their central focus of their games. But my big issue with it really is just it feels so incredibly stiff. And it doesn't feel, at least for the few games that I've tried it on, doesn't feel as responsive as it should, but it works and it's there. But I'm just gonna argue that that would probably be the only downside that I've found in this controller so far. I also did test some accessories like the memory card. It reads that perfectly fine. Nothing significant there. And as far as the controller goes overall, it just generally feels good. And in my opinion, I would argue this is an upgrade over the original N64 controller. And any new controllers I do buy for my N64 will be in this style of model from Kiwitata. I was at first kind of took the risk on this, hoping for the best, but I'm pleasantly happy with everything that this controller delivers. You have a fantastic joystick, an upgraded joystick even. You have buttons that feel incredibly similar to the old N64, and the ergonomics of this just feel good. They feel more modern and they feel more appealing to play some of these older games on than going back to that old N64 controller, which in my opinion, it was good for the time, but it does have some deficits. And the biggest thing about this as well is most of these third-party N64 controllers generally are actually relatively reasonably priced. This was $25 off of Amazon, and in my opinion, for the $25 spent, if you want a modern iteration of an N64 controller and want to revisit some of your old classics in a little bit of a more modern way on your original N64 hardware, I would argue that this controller from Kiwitata is phenomenal.